On December 19, 1944, 2:47 a.m., Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt stood in the command bunker near Ziegenberg, staring at the situation map spread across the table. The pins and markers showed the progress of Operation Wehrmacht am Rhine, Hitler's desperate winter offensive. Panzer columns had punched deep into American lines. Infantry divisions poured through frozen forests. Allied forces reeled backward in confusion. By every tactical measure, the opening phase had succeeded beyond expectation. Von Rundstedt's fingers traced a route on the map, following a line of blue markings representing the American Third Army, currently positioned 200 miles south in the Lorraine sector. His hand stopped. He looked up at the officers surrounding him. "Where is Patton now?" he asked quietly. The room went silent. An intelligence officer stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. Third Army Headquarters, Luxembourg. Last reported disposition shows 9 divisions spread across the Saar front. They are heavily engaged. Supply lines extended. No immediate. Von Rundstedt cut him off. "How long, sir? How long until he's here?" The officer hesitated. Generalfeldmarschall, the Third Army is committed to offensive operations. Their logistics are oriented southward. To disengage, pivot 90 degrees, coordinate 9 divisions across winter terrain, establish new supply routes, and move north would require, at minimum, 2 weeks. More likely 3. The Americans don't have the staff training or operational flexibility to. 3 days, von Rundstedt said flatly. He looked back at the map. Patton will be here in 3 days. The other officers exchanged glances. No one spoke, because they all knew the same thing von Rundstedt knew. When it came to George Patton, the rules didn't apply. To understand why German generals feared Patton more than any other Allied commander, you have to understand what made him different. Not just aggressive, not just bold, but fundamentally unpredictable in a way that broke the standard calculations of modern warfare. German military doctrine in World War II was built on predictability, operational timelines, logistics constraints, staff coordination requirements. They knew how long it took to move a corps-level formation. They knew the fuel consumption rates. They knew that armies didn't pivot on short notice, didn't reorganize mid-campaign, didn't gamble with supply lines. Patton ignored all of it, and the Germans couldn't model what they couldn't predict. Let's go back to the beginning. August 1st, 1944. Avranches, France. 11:20 a.m. The breakout from Normandy had finally begun. After 2 months of grinding attrition in the hedgerows, American forces had cracked the German line at St. Lo. General Omar Bradley's First Army had opened a narrow corridor at Avranches, a gap barely 7 miles wide, choked with rubble and destroyed vehicles. Through that gap, the entire American Third Army was supposed to flow. It was a logistics nightmare. A single road, minimal bridges, tens of thousands of vehicles trying to squeeze through a bottleneck while German artillery still ranged the area. Every staff officer on the Allied side knew the numbers. You could move, at best, 1 division per day through terrain like that. Maybe 2 if you pushed it and accepted heavy losses to traffic jams and air attack. Patton put 7 divisions through in 72 hours. He did it by ignoring every traffic control regulation in the book, by keeping his columns moving 24 hours a day, by putting military police at every intersection with orders to shoot out the tires of any vehicle that stopped for any reason, by moving his headquarters 5 times in 4 days so he could personally scream at bottlenecks until they cleared. German intelligence officers tried to track the movement. They plotted expected arrival times based on standard mechanized advance rates. They calculated fuel requirements. They estimated consolidation periods. Every estimate was wrong. By August 4th, Patton's armor had already reached Rhine, 60 miles south. By August 8th, his forward elements were at Le Mans, 100 miles east. By August 12th, he'd covered 150 miles and was threatening the entire German left flank. In the German 7th Army headquarters, staff officers stared at the maps in disbelief. "This isn't possible," one of them said. But the reconnaissance reports kept coming in. American tanks where they shouldn't be. entire divisions appearing in sectors that intelligence said were still clear. Supply columns racing forward with no apparent concern for flanks, for consolidation, for any of the operational pauses that made warfare predictable. Generaloberst Paul Hauser, commanding the German 7th Army, tried to organize a counterattack. But every time he positioned forces to hit what he thought was Patton's flank, the Americans had already moved. Every time he predicted a pause to regroup, Patton kept going. It was like fighting smoke, and the fear started to set in. Not fear of defeat. The Germans had fought skilled opponents before. Zhukov on the Eastern Front was brutally effective. Montgomery was methodical and thorough. Even Eisenhower, for all his caution, was a competent supreme commander. But Patton was different. He operated at a tempo that broke the German decision-making cycle. By the time they identified his position, analyzed his strength, formulated a response, and issued orders, he'd already be somewhere else doing something they hadn't predicted. In military terms, he got inside their ODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. The faster you cycle through those steps, the more you force your enemy to react instead of plan. Patton cycled faster than anyone they'd ever faced. September 12, 1944. Ericourt, France. 6:15 a.m. The German 5th Panzer Army launched a counteroffensive designed to blunt Patton's advance into Lorraine. On paper, it should have worked. The Germans concentrated over 200 panzers, including the new Panther tanks with their superior armor and guns. They hit the American 4th Armored Division in open terrain, the kind of environment where German armor doctrine excelled. Major General John Wood, commanding the 4th Armored, had 87 Sherman tanks. The battle lasted 6 days. When it ended, the Germans had lost 262 tanks. The Americans lost 25. How? Because Patton had trained his units to fight the way he thought. Aggressively, independently, without waiting for orders. He gave his commanders objectives and trusted them to figure out how to achieve them. When Wood's tankers found themselves outnumbered, they didn't pull back and wait for reinforcement. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, using speed and aggression to offset the technical superiority of German armor. They fought like Patton, and the Germans, who were used to enemies that fought by doctrine, who waited for the plan, who coordinated carefully before committing, didn't know how to respond. After Ericourt, German intelligence reports started using a specific phrase when referring to Third Army operations. Unberechenbar, uncalculable. But it wasn't just speed. It wasn't just aggression. What truly terrified German commanders about Patton was his operational intuition, the way he seemed to see the battlefield 3 moves ahead. November 8, 1944. Metz, France. 4:30 p.m. The fortress city of Metz had stood unconquered since 451 AD. The Germans had fortified it with interlocking defensive positions, underground bunkers, artillery emplacements built into medieval walls. Every approach was covered by fire. Every street was mined. Third Army had been battering against it for weeks, taking heavy casualties. The Germans were confident they could hold indefinitely. The city was supplied. Morale was solid. The Americans would bleed themselves white trying to take it by direct assault. Patton walked into the Third Army operations room and stared at the map for 40 seconds. Then he said, "We're going around it." His staff officers looked at each other. "Sir, we've committed 3 divisions to the assault. We have units inside the outer. Leave 1 regiment to contain it. Pull everyone else out. We're bypassing Metz and driving east." "But General, the fortress could threaten our supply." "They're not going anywhere. They're locked in a static position. Let them sit there. We'll take it when we feel like it." 3 days later, Third Army units were 20 miles past Metz, driving toward the German border. The garrison, cut off and irrelevant, surrendered 2 weeks after that without Third Army having to fire another shot at the city itself. German commanders read the after-action reports with mounting unease. Patton hadn't gotten fixated on the objective. He'd recognized that taking Metz directly was what the Germans wanted him to do. They wanted him stuck in urban warfare, burning through ammunition and men. So he'd simply refused to play. He changed the game. That was what made him dangerous. He didn't just react faster. He thought differently. He saw the war not as a series of tactical problems to solve in sequence, but as a fluid system where you could rewrite the rules by moving faster than your enemy could adapt. December 22nd, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. 9:45 a.m. Von Rundstedt's prediction had been wrong by exactly 7 hours. Patton reached the Ardennes in 2 days and 19 hours. He'd done what every German staff officer said was impossible. Disengaged 9 divisions from active combat. Pivoted them 90 degrees north. Moved them over 100 miles through winter weather on ice-covered roads. Reorganized supply lines on the fly. Coordinated with air support, artillery, and adjacent units. And attacked into the teeth of the German offensive with enough force to break the encirclement of Bastogne. In 71 hours, the Germans had planned the Ardennes offensive around a simple calculation. The Americans were methodical. Eisenhower would need time to assess the situation, convene his commanders, formulate a response. Montgomery in the north would move cautiously. Bradley would be paralyzed by the speed of the German advance. The bulk of American forces were committed elsewhere. By the time they organized a counterattack, the panzers would already be across the Meuse. Nobody had accounted for Patton. On December 19th, while the Battle of the Bulge was still developing, Patton walked into a staff meeting at SHAEF headquarters in Verdun. Eisenhower was grim. The situation was deteriorating. He needed options. Patton said, "I can attack in 3 days." The room went quiet. Eisenhower stared at him. "George, your army is 100 miles away, engaged in offensive operations facing the other direction. I've already issued the orders. We'll be ready." British General Frederick Morgan shook his head. "That's impossible. You'd need to coordinate." "It's done." And it was. Patton had anticipated the possibility of a German counteroffensive weeks earlier. He'd quietly instructed his staff to prepare contingency plans for a rapid movement north. He'd positioned supply dumps. He'd coordinated with engineering units to prepare routes. He'd done it all without authorization, without informing SHAEF, because he knew that if the moment came, there wouldn't be time to ask permission. When the bulge erupted, he was already moving. December 26, 1944. Outside Bastogne. 3:20 p.m. Elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to the encircled 101st Airborne. The siege was lifted. The German offensive, already stalling, began to collapse. In the 5th Panzer Army headquarters, officers watched the American positions shift on the map with something approaching awe. "He did it again," one of them said quietly. General Otto von Manschufel, one of Germany's most capable panzer commanders, sat in silence. He'd fought on the Eastern Front. He'd faced Zhukov's mechanized assaults. He'd dueled with British armor in North Africa. This was different. "Patton doesn't fight battles," von Manschufel said finally. "He fights campaigns. By the time you understand what he's doing, he's already 3 steps ahead." It was the closest thing to a compliment a German general would give. But underneath it was something else. Fear. Because Patton represented something the German military couldn't counter with doctrine or planning. He represented chaos harnessed into operational effect. He was brilliant, yes. Aggressive, certainly. But more than that, he was unpredictable in a way that made him nearly impossible to defend against. You couldn't model his behavior. You couldn't anticipate his next move. You couldn't prepare for him because he didn't follow the templates. February 23, 1945. Trier, Germany. 7:05 a.m. 3rd Army forces captured the city of Trier on the Moselle River, securing a critical crossing point into Germany's industrial heartland. SHAEF headquarters sent a message instructing Patton to bypass Trier and leave it for follow-on forces to clear, arguing that reducing the city would slow his advance. Patton sent back a forward reply, "Have already taken Trier." He hadn't waited for permission. He'd seen the opportunity, taken it, and presented headquarters with a fait accompli. The Germans read the intercepted communications and felt the walls closing in. March 22, 1945. Rhine River. 10:30 p.m. Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim without airborne support, without a massive preliminary bombardment, without any of the elaborate preparations that Montgomery's crossing in the north required. Patton's engineers threw a pontoon bridge across in darkness. Infantry crossed in assault boats. By dawn, they had a bridgehead 3 miles deep. The Germans had fortified the Rhine for months. They knew the Allies would cross eventually. They'd prepared defensive positions, mined the approaches, positioned artillery. But they'd assumed the crossing would come where it made sense, where the terrain favored it, where logistics supported it. Patton crossed where they weren't looking, because that's what he always did. He found the gap, the moment of hesitation, the place where the enemy thought they were safe, and he hit it with everything he had before they could react. In the final months of the war, German commanders stopped trying to predict what Patton would do. They just tried to react fast enough to contain the damage. They failed. Third Army advanced faster than any other Allied formation. They liberated more territory. They captured more prisoners. They reached deeper into Germany. And everywhere they went, German officers recognized the pattern. Fast, aggressive, unpredictable. Patton. April 29, 1945. Czechoslovakia. 2:15 p.m. Third Army had reached the outskirts of Prague. The war in Europe was days from ending. German resistance was collapsing across the front. Patton requested permission to liberate Prague. Eisenhower denied the request. The Soviets were close. Politics dictated that the Red Army should take the city. Patton complied. But in the German units still fighting in the area, there was almost a sense of relief. If Patton had been allowed to come, they knew they wouldn't have been able to stop him. They never had been able to. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interviewed captured German generals as part of the historical documentation process. They asked about tactics, about strategy, about which Allied commanders had been most effective. Almost universally, when asked who they feared most, the answer was the same: Patton. Not because he had the most resources, not because he had the best equipment, not even because he won the most battles, because he fought in a way that broke their ability to respond. Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, put it simply in a post-war interview. Patton was the most dangerous man in Europe, not because of what he did, because you never knew what he would do next. That was the fear. The Germans had built a military machine based on predictability, on calculated risk, on understanding the tempo of modern warfare and exploiting the gaps in enemy decision-making. Patton operated outside that framework. He moved faster than doctrine allowed. He took risks that staff officers said were impossible. He ignored logistics constraints that should have stopped him. He gambled on operational intuition over careful planning. And it worked. Not because he was reckless. Patton's successes weren't accidents. They were the result of a man who understood warfare at a level deeper than tactics or strategy. He understood tempo. He understood psychology. He understood that in war, the side that controls the pace of operations controls the outcome. The final accounting tells the story. Third Army liberated 81,500 square miles of territory. They captured over 760,000 enemy soldiers. They inflicted an estimated 500,000 German casualties. Their own losses, while significant, were proportionally lower than any other comparable Allied formation. They did it in less than a year of combat operations. And they did it because George Patton fought the war on his terms, not the enemy's. May 9, 1945. Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. 11 a.m. The war in Europe was over. Third Army occupied defensive positions across western Czechoslovakia and southern Germany. The shooting had stopped. In his headquarters, Patton sat looking at a map of Europe. His staff officers were celebrating. The job was done. But Patton wasn't celebrating. He was looking east, toward where the Soviet armies were consolidating their positions, securing the territory they'd taken. "We're going to regret this," he said quietly. One of his aides looked over. "Sir, stopping here, we should have kept going." The aide didn't respond. Everyone knew Patton's views on the Soviets. Everyone knew he wanted to keep fighting, to push them back while the momentum was still there. But the war was over. The politicians had made their decisions. Patton folded the map. For the first time in a year, he had nowhere to attack. The legend of George Patton, like all legends, is complicated by myth and reality. He was difficult, arrogant, politically toxic. His mouth got him in trouble repeatedly. His views on everything from military discipline to post-war policy created endless headaches for Eisenhower and the Allied command. But on the battlefield, none of that mattered. What mattered was that when you needed an impossible operation executed in an impossible time frame, you gave it to Patton. What mattered was that the Germans, who had conquered most of Europe with calculated precision, couldn't figure out how to stop him. What mattered was that his army moved faster, hit harder, and adapted quicker than any force the Allies fielded. And the Germans knew it. That's why they feared him. Not because of his reputation, not because of propaganda, not because of bravado, because every single time they thought they had him figured out, he did something they hadn't planned for. Every single time they tried to set a trap, he'd already moved. Every single time they calculated how long they had before he arrived, he showed up early. The historian Martin Blumenson, who spent decades studying Patton's campaigns, wrote something that captures it perfectly. Patton didn't just win battles. He changed the conditions under which battles were fought. That's what made him terrifying. He didn't play the game better. He changed the rules. And in war, against an enemy who depends on predictability, who builds doctrine around calculated responses, who needs time to analyze and react, a man who changes the rules is the most dangerous weapon imaginable. December 21st, 1945. Heidelberg, Germany. 3:45 p.m. George Patton died from injuries sustained in a car accident 12 days after the collision. He never made it home. The Third Army held a memorial service. Thousands attended. Eisenhower gave a eulogy. The military honors were extensive. But perhaps the most telling tribute came from an unexpected source. In the years after the war, as German generals wrote their memoirs and gave interviews, Patton's name appeared again and again. Not with hatred, not with resentment, with respect. The kind of respect soldiers give to an enemy who beat them fairly, who outthought them, who proved himself on the field of battle. Generalfeldmarschall von Rundstedt, in a 1949 interview, was asked who the best Allied general had been. He didn't hesitate. Patton. He was a tank commander who understood that tanks are not merely vehicles. They are tempo. They are psychological pressure. They are the ability to be somewhere the enemy thinks you cannot be. He understood war better than any man I faced. Coming from von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced field commanders, it wasn't just praise. It was acknowledgement that Patton had been right, that speed mattered more than strength, that tempo won battles, that the army that moved fastest controlled the war. The question isn't really why German generals feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. The question is, how could they not? He represented everything their doctrine couldn't handle. Speed over preparation, intuition over analysis, aggression over caution, chaos over control. He fought a different kind of war. And the Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, for all their operational excellence, never found a way to stop it. That's why they feared him. Because fear in war comes from facing something you can't predict, can't prepare for, can't defend against. George Patton was that something. And the Germans knew it every single time they saw Third Army's tanks appear on the horizon. Ahead of schedule, hitting from an unexpected direction, moving faster than should have been possible. They knew the name before the battles even started. Patton. And they knew what it meant. The rules had just changed again.